Hello there and welcome to another Music Ally Focus with me, Music Ally's editor Joe Sparrow, and in this episode we're talking about neurodiversity in the music business with Finlay Johnson, who's interim CEO of the Association for Electronic Music, the AFEM, and Tristan Hunt, who is an ADHD coach for musicians and people working in the music business, and previously was also a regional manager at the AFEM. And can you believe it? But this is episode 100 of the Music Ally Focus podcast. If this podcast was a song, it'd be old enough to be blowing up all over again to a bunch of Gen Z TikTokers. If you listen to every episode of this podcast back to back, it would take about 50 hours. So what else could you have done in that time? I asked ChatGPT to name 3 things that take 50 hours, and it replied, you could create a detailed, high-quality costume for a cosplay event, write a novel or a lengthy research paper, or train for a marathon or other endurance race. As ever, it's a good opportunity to think about what you are doing with your life. And while you do that, why not listen to one of the most insightful and helpful podcasts that we have recorded in that 100 episodes. Last year, the AFEM surveyed people in the electronic music industry to learn more about the neurodiversity of the people working in it. They discovered that 58% of their participants in the survey demonstrated a neurodiverse condition, although only 38% currently have a clinical diagnosis. We discuss how the creativity that results in innovative music being made can also be accompanied by neurodiversity, how the electronic music industry with its inherent late nights and party atmosphere can exacerbate existing issues, and what people who are working in the music industry can do to support colleagues with neurodiverse conditions. It's a great conversation, so let's go over to Finlay and Tristan right now. Okay, so very happy to welcome to the podcast Tristan Hunt and Finlay Johnson. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hi, Joe.
Thanks for joining us. Let's, before we dive into this really interesting topic, can you both introduce yourselves and your roles and explain what you do and how that then relates to neurodiversity as a focus in the music industry?
Hi, my name's Finlay Johnson. I am the interim CEO at the Association for Electronic Music. We are the not-for-profit trade body representing the electronic music ecosystem, from large companies to individual creators. And we became involved in this sector through our survey, Neurodiversity. We wanted to find out the breadth of people in the system that have neurodiversity, and what we can do to help to support them in their careers.
And Tristan.
Hi there, Joe. Thank you. So my name's Tristan Hunt. I'm former AFM regional manager. I was at AFM for 4.5 years. I've been in the music industry for 20 years, working across all sort of different sectors of the industry. And about 2.5 years ago, shortly after I got diagnosed at the age of 40 with ADHD, I realised that there was no real provision for neurodiversity, specifically ADHD support in the music industry, with that sort of knowledge of both the industry, just that sort of germane sort of intrinsic knowledge of how it all works, plus knowledge of neurodiversity, specifically ADHD. So I decided to retrain and retrained as a coach first, and then did further training in the US as an ADHD coach. And then I stepped down from my role at AFM in September of last year, and I've been coaching people within the music industry on ADHD full-time since then.
Great, thanks for that. And we'll dig into the sort of specifics of what you're both doing in those areas in a moment. But just first to sort of set the context and the understanding for our listeners, can you give an explanation of what is meant by the term neurodiversity, and which is quite a broad term in a sense, and maybe give some examples that are perhaps prevalent or common in the music industry?
So, yeah, Joe, great question. In terms of defining neurodiversity, there's a great Harvard doctor's summary of what neurodiversity is, which I really like because it's quite a broad church. It says neurodiversity describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There is no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. And I think it's a really powerful encapsulation of what neurodiversity can be, because it includes things like ASD, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, a whole range of different neurobiological conditions where people think about things in a different way. Now, what that means for our world is that you've got a huge number of creative people within the music industry, and part of their creativity from a neurodiverse point of view, is this idea of non-sequential thinking. So they don't necessarily think in a linear way. They'll put lots of different disparate ideas together and come up with completely new ones. And this is why we'll come on to the sort of AFEM neurodiversity survey later. This is one of the reasons why we think we see so many people with neurodiverse conditions within our industry, because they're very good at creativity. Their brains are orientated in such a way that they can really thrive with producing creative ideas. But that's to say, whilst they excel in that area and many others, they can struggle in others too. And again, we can come on to a bit more, maybe what that looks like later.
So the sort of that non-linear thinking, which helps generate great music or great inventive ideas in the music industry, is also part and parcel of some of these neurodiverse conditions. And so it sounds like a cliche to say that people in the creative world are sort of leaning that way, but it does actually make sense in terms of how they think specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I speak to ADHD specifically, because that's where I've sort of done the most amount of my research and study, you have this ability to think in a non-sequential way, to put these ideas together and come up with these wonderful new ideas, whether that's you're a marketer or you're an A&R manager, or you're an artist coming up with the actual new song ideas, that it really helps with that thinking process. But what the flip side to that is, it can make everyday stuff really tough. So like the putting in of the invoice for the song that you've submitted to the label can be an incredibly challenging task for the artist, because there's a process behind that. And often what we find is that people, not always, but certainly people with ADHD especially, often find sort of forms and specific processes that puts them into a box quite confining, constraining, and for a number of different reasons it can make doing that task very challenging. Whilst they might absolutely thrive at the creative process, those everyday tasks can be a bit tougher.
Really interesting, and I'm sure this will resonate with a lot of people who are listening. The familiar experiences or witnessing familiar things. Talking to that then, so how might the people in the music industry who are, you touched on it there, who are neurodiverse be affected by the processes or the pressures or the conditions of the industry? And are there any particular quirks of the music industry, and particularly the electronic music industry, that has a positive or negative effect in that sense?
I think that the music industry, from the kind of the industry side rather than the artist side, is unique in a lot of ways. There is often a cult of personality. And what that means is people have big personalities and they communicate in a certain way to instill a sense of value or status in the work that they're doing. And that can create friction with people who communicate in a slightly different way. So often people who are neurodiverse can be sensitive in some ways, and the person who is the big personality is actually a bit of a front for the purposes of the guy getting the client or the person getting the deal done. And actually it's not really reflective of their true personality. And I think that sort of environment creates barriers to effective, clear communication, and the subtlety can be lost. I think that's one aspect of the industry. The other side, in terms of the electronic aspects, it's very strange hours, it's odd nights, so it's not you don't have the same structure in terms of your working. So you can't get your head in a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. Okay, this is my time to be focused on work. Actually, you're at work at 3 a.m. on a Saturday, and that creates its own, I think, issues in terms of boundaries and clear communication, and having in your head, this is my social moment and this is my business moment. The two merge, it becomes a lifestyle, and I think there's a real tension at times around that communication.
Yes, it becomes an all or nothing thing, doesn't it? I mean, it's if you're DJing at 2 a.m. or something, and that's a regular slot, the headline slot, that's a very different lifestyle, and maybe one that works until it stops working, and that's complicated, isn't it? Tristan, what about you? What other parts of the music industry might sort of connect with people with neurodiversity in ways that are not perhaps so helpful?
So I think what we often find within record labels or companies in general, sort of medium bigger companies, they often work in this sort of open plan format, like a lot of other businesses from other sectors. Being in an open plan office environment for somebody with a neurodiverse condition can be very challenging. So if you have something like ADHD, for example, it can be incredibly distracting. So the challenge for people with that particular condition is just to bring their focus to attention on a single task. And if you have a lot of noise and disruption around you, people A&Ring in one corner, chatting in another, telephones going off behind you, just to get that task done that other people might find relatively straightforward, can be so much more demanding, because you're having to expend a huge amount of cognitive power filtering out all of these other sounds and disruptions around you. Visual, we're taking about sort of 40-45% of our world through our eyes, so visual distraction can be a huge part, and then auditory is also a huge aspect as well. So just by simply being in that space can make it extremely challenging for people with those conditions to function and get their tasks done.
So we've got this weird sort of duality where we've got an industry that is reliant on people who think in this non-sequential way and who may be therefore more likely to be affected by neurodiverse things. But at the same time, then the industry has this kind of, let's say, hyper-confident front, which is needed to be able to sell what they are producing. And that is a recipe that doesn't, it's like oil and water in some ways, isn't it? But they have to exist together. Finlay, the AFEM recently published a neurodiversity study on this. And what did it reveal? What were the key learnings? And what did you find out from doing this?
So I think what the survey did was capture a broad spectrum of people in different sectors of the industry. So it's not just focused on artists, or it's not just focused on labels, but actually it's an entire cross-section. And the other part that's unique about it is that it was global. So it went out to our entire membership base. So we surveyed 137 people within the electronic music industry. 45% of the respondents were from the UK and 22% were from the US. So that gives you a certain kind of weighting in terms of where people are from. 58% of those participants demonstrated a neurodiverse condition, although 38% currently have a clinical diagnosis. So we see a gap there in people that are presenting with the condition, but perhaps lack the accessibility to get a formal clinical diagnosis and get that support or assistance they might need. And also in their head, the ability to validate how they feel and talk about it with a kind of registered name attached to it, when in actual fact, they're experiencing that condition and they've got their own unique challenges and their own workarounds already in place to help adapt with that. So that's one of the interesting aspects that I think we as an industry need to help support and find solutions to, and get people access to the ability to have a clinical diagnosis.
Is that quite a common thing then, that there are people who are undiagnosed, or they're not even aware that what they are has a diagnosis?
I think so. I think it's an interesting area as well. So, for example, I have epilepsy. So that has informed the way that I communicate and the way that I work, because the sense of loss of control that I've had through my seizures has driven me to a very organized, list-driven, structure-based working life. And the way that I communicate is all around that, because I've experienced that emotional kind of turmoil from loss of control that I then seek it in almost every other part of my life. And I'm a little bit too neat and tidy occasionally to my own detriment. Right. So I think that's an example of, I don't have a neurodivergent clinical diagnosis, but it's a brain condition that has influenced the way I communicate. And I've made adaptations to that to make myself feel better. And that's an example where I'm probably in that kind of 58%, but I'm not in the 38% that have a clinical diagnosis. I just have my epilepsy. I've always had it, and it makes me who I am. And I've adapted around it, in terms of making myself feel good at work and being effective in my job is the best way I can be.
Yeah. Tristan, you said you were diagnosed with ADHD when you were 40. Is that an increasingly common thing where people are, perhaps this is a diagnosis people are experiencing later in their lives?
I think it is, and it's a great point, because there's been a lot of publicity in the press recently about there's a sudden upsurge in people getting ADHD and other diagnoses at the moment, and that it's perhaps some sort of fashionable trend to go and do that, or it's an excuse for something. It couldn't be further from the truth. What we're actually seeing is that since lockdown happened and people were removed from the social environments that often help to scaffold them so well, and maybe sort of make their symptoms much more manageable, we saw a huge uptick globally in people seeking certainly ADHD diagnosis from the point of lockdown forward to now. And what we're seeing really is people realizing that these traits, these symptoms that they've had for their entire lives, actually now have an explanation. That around about 4 to 5% of the population are believed to have ADHD, and there's statistics for dyslexia, dyscalculia, Tourette's, ASD, etc. as well. But what we're seeing now, Joe, is really just people finally getting their needs met. So they're getting diagnosed for these conditions that have been lifelong, and often have not been sort of addressed as we'd like them to be.
Finlay, you were talking before about how there's a lot of front, right? So there's a sort of business where it's a bit, I don't want to say macho, but there's a bit of sort of, people don't want to show weakness, they want to show only confidence, only front, right? Do you think that industry, which is changing, let's acknowledge that, but do you think that kind of old industry has stopped people in the past from being able to like either talk about these kind of things or even get help for these kind of things?
I think absolutely. I think historically, there's a certain amount of if you say you have a condition, it's deemed a weakness for some reason. And actually, I think what we're trying to point out with this survey is that that's not necessarily the case. I think the people with neurodiverse conditions have a real strength and creativity to bring to the table. There's just certain adaptations that you need to make. And I think when people can realize that, they're going to see this as not as something they need to accommodate, but actually it's in their benefit to accommodate. You're going to get a lot of different influences and opinions and creativity brought to your table rather than a linear way of thinking, and your business being in a very specific way. So I think actually there's a real benefit to embracing people with neurodiverse conditions in your workforce, making those small allowances and allowing them to flourish and harnessing that creativity for your business output. It makes sense to both the bottom line and in a social sense, so that more people feel welcome in your place of work as well. And I think, anecdotally, the birth of social media has got a potential to coincide with this, because it used to be when I was growing up, people couldn't see that I wasn't a great speller. Now on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, people can see if you maybe have dyslexia. And so those sorts of things have come to the fore, I think, because we're asking artists to express themselves more online in a more authentic way. And these sorts of things are coming to the fore, specifically within that thread of neurodiversity. So I think that's something else also to bear in mind.
Can I just jump in on that point around artists? That a significant number of the clients that I work with are artist management agencies. And what we're seeing now really is them bringing in people like myself and other coaches for specific conditions to not only coach and support their artists, but also to inform their teams. And this isn't just artist management companies. I'm working with record labels, with distributors, with a whole range of different music industry businesses that are bringing in people now to really sort of upskill their staff so that they are fully cognizant of how neurodiverse conditions can present themselves, and then what they can do to support those individuals that have these conditions. And this is a huge shift, Joe, from where we've previously been. This is very new territory. I think we're kind of where we were with mental health as a community, as an industry, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. With neurodiversity now, now we see mental health as a standard part of any conference that you go to. It's always it's a key part of the of the conference plan. And now we're starting to see neurodiversity rising to the surface. We did AVA Printworks last week, had an AFEM panel there on the topic, with a wealth of people from across the industry speaking out on neurodiversity. And increasingly conferences are starting to lean into this, because it's seen as being a topic area that is worth expanding and developing, that people can learn from, and then use those skills to support their colleagues and also artists. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that then, which is, there are people listening and perhaps they run a music business, or they're thinking about their colleagues. First of all, then, let's think about how they can offer support to their colleagues or their customers, people who have coming to the clubs and coming to their events and things like that. With regards to neurodiversity, just perhaps in terms of, you can talk us through what you actually do as a coach. What does that entail, and how does it aim to help and change things?
So with ADHD, we're looking to build a routine. So often what you find is that people working within the music industry, part of the appeal, of course, of being in this business, is that it's very free thinking and open and often unstructured. Now that's great, but for people that have neurodiverse conditions, specifically ADHD in this case, that can be quite disruptive. So although it's appealing in some ways, it means that they can't necessarily function to the optimum of their ability. So what we look to do is to give them a structure, a daily routine that they choose, that they make, that can lead them to feeling much more comfortable, feeling much more settled, focused, calm, with a greater sense of tranquility through their life. Now, once you've got that to come back to you time and time again, then you can start to focus more on the work that you're doing. And lots of these things, they're very simple, they're free, and that when you introduce these ideas to people, like having a structured day that works for them, that incorporates a good diet, exercise, meditation, all of these sorts of things, then they notice results quite quickly. And these aren't particularly onerous things for people to do. And in terms of working with businesses, we're looking about what are the reasonable adjustments that businesses can make to support their neurodiverse colleagues. Whether that's allowing people to work from home more, or it's providing them with silent spaces at work. Maybe there's quiet rooms or areas that are free of auditory distraction or visual distraction. There's a range of different things that can be provided from screen readers and different coloured paper, depending if you have access, it'd be really helpful. There's a whole range of different things out there that can be done.
Right, great. And Finlay, what about you? AFEM has published this report. I'll link to it beneath the podcast, of course. Encourage people to read it. But what have you sort of concluded from that the industry can? Do you have recommendations for the industry or things that people listening can sort of put into place?
There's certainly adaptations that can be made. And prior to my work for AFEM, I worked in a music agency for 10 years. So it's very much an office environment. And I had colleagues that were neurodivergent. And I think there are accommodations you can make. So, for example, I had colleagues that they knew they worked best at certain times of the day. So we would have an agreement that rather than try and speak to them in the morning, we would speak in the evening at a time where they felt more energized and it worked better for them and they were in the zone to do working. I also had dyslexic colleagues. So if we needed a report on something or an update, I would ask for it verbally, and we would just have an agreement that I would write the notes from that verbal update. So that would be a way around it, and it'd be quicker than them typing it and worrying about mistakes and having that anxiety. It allowed them to express themselves and improve their ability to communicate and speak, and give reports in that way. And I think the other aspect is just it's all about communication and finding out how people work best. And so for as Tristan mentioned about the structure, my backgrounds made me very structured, but for colleagues that were perhaps neurodivergent and required that structure, I would have, if there was a piece of work that was required and there wasn't a deadline, I would just create a deadline that was mutually agreeable and have check-in points along the way. So it allowed them to see the arc of it, and they knew that there would be check-in points in between that would require a quarter of the work done and a half of the work done, and it allowed them to not view the work in hand as one massive piece, but actually smaller, more manageable pieces. So everyone's different, and that won't work for everyone. But for the colleagues that I was working with, these were adaptations I could make to my working life that got the best out of them. And that might be something that people can do. So one of the outcomes from the survey was that 52% of people with a condition have told their organization or employer, but only 23% have said they've asked for support at that workplace. So to me, there's a gap there. And these are some of the practical things I think people can do to accommodate that. But ultimately, it's about the personal relationship with yourself and the colleague.
And this is interesting because the suggestions you're making here are really simple in some senses. It's about putting a structure in place to help people. And of course, I guess there's technological solutions as well. There's so many platforms now. I think about how much as a journalist, I lean on AI transcription software where, I put a recording of an interview in and all the text comes out and it's pretty much perfect. It's a shining daylight on magic a little bit from a journalist perspective, but that's really helpful. So it's something which the steps to make changes are actually easy to do and empowering, and you get the best out of people, which I think is a really it feels really good to hear that, doesn't it? And so for people who are listening then who are thinking, perhaps they're wondering if they may have some form of neurodiversity. Tristan, you said that there has been increased talk about this recently, and people are sort of perhaps considering for the first time that maybe they're recognizing something in some of these neurodiverse things that they're reading about. So if people are starting to think, oh, I'm not sure, but maybe, what can they do in terms of getting clarification on that, and where do they go from there?
There's a range of online tests they can do, and generally, if you type into Google ASD test, ADHD test, you'll get a range of different tests, and the quality of these varies enormously. But certainly, if you go into places like the ADHD Foundation, I have one on my site for ADHD as well, from the World Health Organization, adapted from that they give you, after a couple of minutes, they're pretty short to do, they give you a score, and they give you some indication as to whether or not exploring an official diagnosis might be worth doing. The benefits of getting a diagnosis, and some people talk about, what's the point, it's just a label. It's far more than a label. So for a lot of people, it finally provides that point of clarity that they've always sought. Why is it that I can go and do overseas business at a high level, and yet when I return home, my partner's there in disarray going, why haven't you paid the electric bill? Or you can go, a person can go and do a world tour, and they come back and, they haven't sorted out their insurance or basic everyday tasks. Their partner's complaining because they still haven't taken the bin out, which is often quite common. That there's this sort of cognitive dissonance between what a person's capable of doing at one end, and then the day-to-day life, which is often quite different. That this provides an answer for that. So at least then they go, okay, it's not because I'm stupid or lazy or not trying hard enough. This is because of a neurological condition, and it's not me. But then what it also means is that we can coach very specifically to that, and there's a range of different people out there, providing sort of services to help people. But that you can also, if you wanted to, certainly for ADHD, you can look to get medication, which I take myself. I've been taking ADHD meds now, stimulant medication now, for about 2.5 years. And it's been life-changing. It's literally like putting on glasses and going, oh my God, I can see. This is what clarity of text looks like. So there's a range of different options out there for people to consider that could be beneficial in terms of getting an assessment.
Right. And I guess even just the sort of the process of going through this and addressing it, and you're doing some tests. I'll put a link to your website as well so people can see this. But even doing that would provide some sort of feeling of taking the pressure off. They're sort of grappling with it and allowing them to move on to the next stage of understanding it.
That's right. And I think you use the key word there, Joe, which is understanding. That often people have had no understanding, and in the absence of that understanding, they've been incredibly hard to themselves. And a great number of my clients, myself included, before I understood it better, have just been the worst judge and jury of themselves that they'll ever encounter. There's no bit of negative fan feedback online or anything they're going to get from their colleagues that's going to compare to how harsh a critic they are of themselves inside. And so with that understanding, that clarity, comes a way of being able to process the world in a much healthier way, that can feel for people a lot lighter. It can feel less burdensome, and their quality of life can improve significantly.
Yeah, fascinating. Like I said, I'm going to put links to the study and to your site, Tristan, as well. And people can check those out. Are there any other starting points that either of you can recommend, or if people are listening from any perspective, if they're thinking about themselves or their colleagues or their workplace, other than your two respective reports and sites, is there any other good resources that you can recommend?
So for ADHD, Attitude magazine, ADDITUDE.com. In the US, it's a free publication. You can subscribe, but otherwise it's free to access. And that's got a wealth of fantastic peer-reviewed, medically approved information on the condition, covering every single aspect of it. There's a great book by a guy called Dr. Edward Halliwell, ADHD 2.0, which is considered by many as sort of like the go-to resource for understanding ADHD for the general population. Very accessible, very easy to read, and lots of light bulb moments when you read that publication. Here in the UK, we've got the ADHD Foundation, which is another fantastic resource with a wealth of information on there about the condition. That's one of the nicest things now. We've moved to a space now where there's actually a huge amount of really good quality information that's out there. I know the Musicians Union are doing some fantastic work in this area, as are Help Musicians, two organisations that are well worth checking out in terms of the resources they've got, Help Musicians, Music Minds Matter, looks very specifically at mental health, but also covering neurodiversity. And I know that Musicians Union are also doing some more work in this area. So we've got sort of general information out there for the general population, which is also relevant to us. But then we've got organisations like the MU and Help Musicians that are doing much more tailored information for our community.
I also think there's a real benefit to that communication and community approach. AFEM members, Tonic, are really good in this space. They run a peer-to-peer support network. So that's not a space necessarily for clinical information in the way that Tristan's described, but just to meet people in a kind of non-judgmental space to talk about how it is that you work and the challenges you face. It's a fantastic resource I can thoroughly recommend.
Great. And to sort of perhaps look towards the future a little bit, what would the electronic music industry, in all of its facets, what would it look like if people were being, if all these kind of positive changes happened and people were being supported better, people were able to operate better in this space? What are the sort of those bigger benefits what would a better industry look like if this all came to pass?
I think we'd have a much less stressed industry. I think we'd have a much happier industry. I think we'd have an industry with much greater understanding, where points of tension are maybe resolved, because we can, if you don't have a neurodiverse condition, that you can see that maybe somebody, where they're coming from, they're not acting out of a point of negativity, perhaps, if it's a point of tension, that's perhaps their neurodiverse condition that's showing up, because perhaps they're extremely tired, or the environment around them is stressing them, so it's bringing out their symptoms. A lot of these conditions are environmentally dependent, and that suddenly changes the narrative, doesn't it? Where we are understanding where people are coming from, and we're meeting them there, rather than possibly just reacting to where they might be. So I think that's sort of an overall benefit. But then we've spoken about the creativity that comes from these wonderful individuals. That we can harness that far better. If people, especially artists who have neurodiverse conditions, are adequately supported and given the opportunity to thrive, then we're going to get much greater output, and we're going to get a much more sort of sustainable careers in terms of their longevity. People are going to be able to work for much longer in a much healthier, happier way. So I think from that perspective that there's a range of positive outputs to be gained.
I would say you would hear the difference on the dance floor. I think the music would get broader, and we would move away from a kind of homogenized approach to music, because somebody with great A&R ears who runs a fantastic label shouldn't feel discouraged from achieving that if they can't deal with the admin, or there's aspects of the job that they just can't do. Adaptations can be made, and they can do the job to the best of their ability. We're going to get more interesting records from a wider group of people, rather than just the same set that can do this particular set of admin that is now all digital. And I think allowing people to approach that in different ways is going to really broaden the number of records we can hear, and hopefully diversify the dance floor as well.
Yeah, which sounds great, doesn't it? Okay, thanks for that. Well, I mean, look, I'll put links to the things that you mentioned. Before we go, as a little bit of context for our listeners to understand who you are, I would throw you a curveball question, which is, if both of you could select just one piece of music to take with you for the rest of your life, what would it be? This is often the hardest question I ask.
Well, from my side, this is not really leaning into the electronic music industry side of me, and you can see there's a set of CDJs behind me, so
yes,
I'm actually genuinely quite into the music. But it would probably be Paul Simon Graceland's. I'm a huge fan of that album, because it just, when you listen to it on a big system, especially, the detail in that is superb, and it's got sort of wonderful calming moments with wonderful enigmatic and energetic moments. So I might choose that.
A great choice, a fantastic record, and you're the first person to choose that. So great. And Finlay, what about you?
I would take Quartet Rounds. I think I love the record more than anything. I also think it reminds me of being younger. 15 years ago, I was watching him support Timo Maas at the end. Longer than that, maybe 20 years ago now, actually, now I think about it. And now he's at Madison Square Gardens. And it's a great metaphor for the long arc of the electronic music career. If you stick at it and you're true to your vision, you can see the different places you can go. And it's both a great record and an amazing career story. So that'd be mine, I think.
I can wholeheartedly agree. Fantastic to see his career develop over the years, and a brilliant musician. So 2 great choices, and I will put links to those below the podcast as well. So Tristan Hunt and Finlay Johnson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
And there we are. So a big thanks to Tristan and Finlay for joining us again. That was episode 100. And if you found that useful, please do share the podcast on with someone else who you think will find it useful. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, as ever, please do. It's joe@musically.com. That's joe@musically.com. We also have a free weekly email, don't forget, called The Knowledge, which rounds up bits and pieces of all the stuff that Music Ally does so well and drops it in your inbox every Friday. So sign up with the link that's below the podcast, and you will instantly become a better person. That's a guarantee. Okay, so that's it from me, Joe Sparrow. Thank you for joining us here on the Music Ally podcast, as ever, and see you next time.